Hey there, welcome back to Bedtime Story. I know many of you listen to these videos as you fall asleep, so before you settle in, I'd really love to hear where you're tuning in from. And if these stories have been keeping you company at night, leaving a like and subscribing would mean a lot. Now, let's relax, get cozy, take a slow breath, and begin. The last gas station before the Appalachian Mountains. Deep in the isolated foothills of western North Carolina, a lonely roadside service station experienced a completely unexplainable, terrifying event. During the bitter winter of 2018, a night shift employee encountered something that defies basic, logical, scientific explanation. What local authorities eventually uncovered safely completely destroyed the quiet, peaceful illusion of that specific dark rural mountain community forever. Archive notes from the massive official investigation describe a highly disturbing timeline of events that still haunt state police today. 25-year-old Ethan Carter worked as a dedicated night attendant, simply trying to save money for upcoming college. His isolated workplace was a highly outdated rural fueling station located miles away from any major, modern, bustling interstate highways. His primary daily objective required him to safely manage the small convenience store completely alone during the long, dark nights. The county file from 2009 actually mentions several highly unusual missing traveler cases originating from that exact region. Ethan arrived on December 4th and immediately began carefully cleaning the dusty store aisles while listening to the quiet radio. The first quiet, freezing hours passed entirely without any significant dangerous incidents as the exhausted young attendant sorted inventory boxes. State records confirm that severe scattered winter storms unexpectedly bypassed their specific elevation despite highly ominous regional weather forecast predictions. However, Ethan looked up shortly after midnight because he clearly heard strange, heavy speeding tires violently skidding across the asphalt. He initially assumed a lost, sleepy traveler was aggressively stopping at the remote, isolated gas station, searching for quick directions. When he cautiously looked directly outside through the heavy glass windows, the speeding dark vehicle instantly parked in the shadows. 40-year-old Marcus Thorne was an experienced commercial delivery driver who desperately needed to find the main interstate highway. He aggressively burst through the heavy glass doors while constantly glancing backward toward the dark, unforgiving frozen tree line outside. The highly stressed driver was completely, severely, physically shaking and violently demanding immediate access to the secure back office telephone. Some locals claimed a rogue commercial logging outfit operated illegally nearby and aggressively chased lost delivery drivers off their roads. Investigators never confirmed those specific, wild, unsubstantiated rumors and firmly maintained the area was entirely devoid of hostile local loggers. The highly stressful situation escalated drastically during that dark hour when an awful chemical smell suddenly arrived continuously inside there. Reportedly, the foul, suffocating odor tightly resembled burning synthetic plastic mixed heavily with the sharp scent of raw industrial sulfur. Both isolated, terrified men immediately started coughing violently and aggressively struggling to breathe properly inside the completely sealed convenience store. Ethan quickly grabbed his portable emergency radio to call for immediate outside medical assistance, but only received loud, aggressive static. Dispatch logs show no emergency distress calls were ever successfully officially recorded by the regional sheriff department during that night. Suddenly, a massive, unseen, heavy physical force violently shook the solid concrete foundation and violently rattled the thick store windows. Ethan scrambled frantically behind the heavy wooden checkout counter and desperately aimed his high-powered security flashlight toward the pumps. The glowing beam instantly revealed an enormous, intense, dark mass standing perfectly still directly behind the parked commercial delivery truck. The strange, dark anomaly lacked any discernible biological features and completely blocked the normal bright ambient light from the canopy. Records conflict regarding exactly how long they silently, terrifyingly watched the imposing tall anomaly before it slowly, finally, silently retreated. Marcus frantically, urgently insisted he absolutely needed to completely abandon his heavy commercial vehicle and lock the storefront doors. Ethan completely strongly agreed, but they soon realized the main electrical breaker panel was constantly randomly displaying completely erratic sparks. They were effectively hopelessly trapped inside a massive, unforgiving wilderness region known for permanently disorienting, highly experienced commercial delivery drivers. The desperate, anxious driver decided to blindly, violently run toward his parked truck, hoping to retrieve his heavy defensive firearm. He confidently, blindly sprinted continuously through the freezing dark parking lot until he eventually physically disappeared behind the massive vehicle. Ethan remained entirely, completely silently hidden behind the thick, solid wooden counter while intensely listening for any sudden aggressive movements. Archived notes from Ethan stated he repeatedly caught brief, terrifying glimpses of pale, smooth, large objects moving swiftly near pumps. Every single time he abruptly, cautiously raised his head to firmly point out the hidden observer, the pale shapes vanished. Utter physical mental exhaustion eventually heavily forced him to quickly, carefully establish a completely vulnerable, unprotected defensive position down low. He huddled tightly, safely against the heavy metal safe while strongly clutching a heavy steel tire iron for necessary protection. Around 2 in the freezing morning, the surrounding dark, dense woods suddenly fell totally dead silent as freezing winds stopped. A deep, guttural, mechanical humming sound slowly, continuously began to violently vibrate through the damp dirt beneath the concrete floor. Some locals claimed strange underground natural gas releases occasionally plagued the Appalachian region, but geologists officially formally found zero evidence. Ethan frantically, aggressively scanned the pitch-black distant parking lot with his heavy flashlight, but the expensive digital battery died. He silently screamed internally in absolute, sheer, unadulterated terror when a tall, pale, smooth shape casually stepped near the window. The towering, featureless, pale entity did not overtly, aggressively attack the reinforced glass, but simply stood motionless, completely staring blankly. Ethan slowly, hesitantly gripped his heavy steel tire iron tightly, but his frozen, numb fingers were constantly, heavily trembling violently. The bizarre, towering, unknown creature emitted another deep, deafening, humming vocalization that violently, instantly, completely shattered the thick storefront windows. Plunged into total, suffocating, pitch-black darkness inside the store, the terrified young attendant blindly, frantically crawled toward the back. He hopelessly, blindly waited continuously inside the highly secure, locked storage room until the early morning sunlight eventually safely arrived. A commercial timber delivery operator miraculously, happily found the rural property completely devastated near the heavily designated gravel access channel. The highly traumatized young attendant was severely badly dehydrated and suffering from multiple minor bleeding lacerations caused by broken glass. State records confirm he was quickly, safely, immediately transported to a local regional medical hospital and strictly treated for shock. When heavily armed local police deputies eventually, carefully, safely navigated back to retrieve the abandoned truck, they discovered sheer chaos. The heavy, durable steel vehicle doors were completely, entirely melted into toxic puddles, and all metal engine components were twisted. Marcus was tragically, completely, never officially seen visiting his concerned family again, despite the massive, highly coordinated regional police presence. Highly trained tracking search dogs completely, entirely lost any distinct individual scent trails near the steep edge of the woods. Law enforcement officials strongly, firmly suspected the blindly, quickly fleeing driver accidentally, entirely fatally fell into a hidden deep sinkhole. However, they absolutely could not logically, realistically explain how the heavy steel doors were completely melted by extreme high temperatures. The overwhelming putrid atmospheric sulfur smell and the highly localized underground ground vibrations also strictly remained completely, totally, officially unsolved. Ethan completely, permanently, fully abandoned his promising early college education plans and rapidly moved to a bustling, noisy, populated city. He completely, absolutely, strictly refused to conduct any further public media interviews regarding his terrifying, unexplainable, deep, dark station experiences. He eventually, quietly, safely wrote a highly obscure, completely anonymous internet blog detailing his intense, lingering, severe, heavy psychological trauma. Reportedly, he deeply, severely suffered from chronic, daily, heavy insomnia and constant, terrifying nightmares featuring tall, faceless, smooth, looming entities. Dispatch logs routinely, regularly show he frequently frantically called local urban police authorities, continually complaining about strange, heavy mechanical vibrations. The deep, dark, isolated rural gas station remains mostly completely thoroughly abandoned and deeply heavily feared by many local residents. Experienced local rural real estate agents actively, aggressively, strictly discourage overly ambitious amateur novice buyers from widely exploring that acreage. Official public state records conflict regarding the actual total, highly accurate number of missing traveler cases strictly linked to wilderness. Some ambitious, independent, amateur internet investigators occasionally, dangerously, completely venture into the dark, ruined station, hoping to finally capture evidence. Most of them always safely return completely empty-handed, while a few others quickly emerge with deeply unsettling, disturbing stories. The absolute, total, complete lack of any definitive, hard physical evidence heavily, continually, profoundly frustrates those who genuinely believe Ethan. The completely destroyed internal security cameras conveniently, completely, permanently erased any potential digital visual proof of the giant outside entity. Vociferous internet online skeptics constantly, loudly, aggressively argue that sheer blind panic and total utter darkness easily successfully transformed reality. Archived notes, carefully, thoroughly gathered from the official local police investigation, confidently, strictly concluded that an undocumented toxic gas leaked. Yet the exact, highly specific, true physical origin nature of those massive, perfectly smooth circular tracks remains completely officially contested. University biology science experts quickly, easily, permanently dismiss the crazy, ridiculous, bizarre idea of a completely unknown, massive humanoid animal. They firmly, constantly, strongly argue that an active, healthy, massive breeding population of large hidden creatures would leave physical evidence. No unusual animal, organic hair samples, or strange skeletal biological bone remains have ever been definitively, positively, completely, conclusively linked. Some locals claimed the federal, national, centralized government quietly, aggressively, permanently suppressed the actual truth to secretly protect classified operations. Investigators never confirmed any grand, illegal, hidden conspiracy and simply safely, permanently, officially closed the bizarre, terrifying, isolated station case. The unmarked road, hidden deep in Appalachia. Deep in the heavily forested Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia, a lost driver experienced a completely unexplainable, terrifying event. During the bitter winter of 2020, a dedicated commercial trucker encountered something that defies basic, logical, scientific explanation. What local authorities eventually uncovered completely destroyed the quiet, peaceful illusion of that specific dark rural mountain community forever. Archive notes from the massive official investigation describe a highly disturbing timeline of events that still haunts state police today. 42-year-old Arthur Pendleton worked as a dedicated commercial transport driver, simply trying to finish his route. His isolated route forced him through a highly outdated rural mountainous region located miles away from any major modern interstates. His primary daily objective required him to safely deliver heavy industrial equipment completely alone during the long, dark winter nights. The county file from 2009 actually mentioned several highly unusual missing traveler cases originating from that exact region. Arthur arrived on November 12th and immediately began carefully navigating the icy, narrow roads while listening to the quiet radio. The first quiet, freezing hours passed entirely without any significant dangerous incidents, as the exhausted driver cautiously navigated sharp turns. State records confirm that severe, scattered winter storms unexpectedly bypassed their specific elevation despite highly ominous regional weather forecast predictions. However, Arthur stopped his massive truck shortly after midnight because he clearly saw a massive fallen tree blocking the highway. He initially assumed a severe winter windstorm had aggressively knocked the massive dead pine completely across the designated rural road. When he cautiously looked directly at his digital navigation map, he noticed a highly obscure, unmarked dirt bypass road nearby. Arthur aggressively turned his heavy commercial vehicle onto the unpaved path, hoping to safely bypass the massive solid wooden obstruction. The highly stressful situation escalated drastically during that dark hour when an awful chemical smell suddenly arrived continuously inside there. Reportedly, the foul, suffocating odor tightly resembled burning synthetic plastic, mixed heavily with the sharp scent of raw industrial sulfur. The isolated, terrified driver immediately started coughing violently and aggressively struggling to breathe properly inside the completely sealed truck cabin. Arthur quickly grabbed his portable emergency radio to call for immediate outside medical assistance, but only received loud, aggressive static. Dispatch logs show no emergency distress calls were ever successfully officially recorded by the regional sheriff department during that night. Suddenly, a massive, unseen, heavy physical force violently shook the solid dirt foundation and violently rattled the thick truck windows. Arthur scrambled frantically behind the heavy wooden steering wheel and desperately aimed his high-powered security flashlight toward the trees. The glowing beam instantly revealed an enormous, intense, dark mass standing perfectly still directly behind the parked commercial delivery truck. The strange dark anomaly lacked any discernible biological features and completely blocked the normal bright ambient light from the moon. Records conflict regarding exactly how long he silently, terrifyingly watched the imposing tall anomaly before it slowly, finally, silently retreated. Arthur frantically, urgently insisted he absolutely needed to completely abandon the dangerous dirt road and aggressively reverse his heavy vehicle. He completely strongly pushed the heavy transmission lever, but he soon realized the main electrical engine panel was displaying sparks. He was effectively hopelessly trapped inside a massive, unforgiving wilderness region known for permanently disorienting, highly experienced commercial delivery drivers. The desperate, anxious driver decided to blindly, violently run toward the back, hoping to retrieve his heavy defensive metal tools. He confidently, blindly sprinted continuously through the freezing dark dirt road until he eventually physically discovered massive, strange, deep tracks. Arthur remained entirely, completely, silently hidden behind the thick, solid metal trailer while intensely listening for any sudden, aggressive movements. Archived notes from Arthur stated he repeatedly caught brief, terrifying glimpses of pale, smooth, large objects moving swiftly near trees. Every single time he abruptly, cautiously raised his head to firmly point out the hidden observer, the pale shapes vanished. Utter physical mental exhaustion eventually heavily forced him to quickly, carefully establish a completely vulnerable, unprotected defensive position down low. He huddled tightly safely against the heavy metal tires while strongly clutching a heavy steel wrench for absolutely necessary protection. Around 2 in the freezing morning, the surrounding dark, dense woods suddenly fell totally dead silent as freezing winds stopped. A deep, guttural, mechanical humming sound slowly, continuously began to violently vibrate through the damp dirt beneath the rubber tires. Some locals claimed strange underground natural gas releases occasionally plagued the Appalachian region, but geologists officially formally found zero evidence. Arthur frantically, aggressively scanned the pitch-black distant tree line with his heavy flashlight, but the expensive digital battery died. He silently screamed internally in absolute, sheer, unadulterated terror when a tall, pale, smooth shape casually stepped near the vehicle. The towering, featureless, pale entity did not overtly, aggressively attack the reinforced metal, but simply stood motionless, completely staring blankly. Arthur slowly, hesitantly gripped his heavy steel wrench tightly, but his frozen, numb fingers were constantly heavily trembling, extremely violently. The bizarre, towering, unknown creature emitted another deep, deafening, humming vocalization that violently, instantly, completely shattered the thick truck windows. Plunged into total, suffocating, pitch-black darkness outside the truck, the terrified driver blindly, frantically crawled toward the deep brush. He hopelessly, blindly waited continuously inside the highly secure, hidden, thorny bush until the early morning sunlight eventually safely arrived. A commercial timber delivery operator miraculously happily found the rural vehicle completely abandoned near the heavily designated gravel access channel. The highly traumatized young driver was severely, badly dehydrated and suffering from multiple minor bleeding lacerations caused by broken glass. State records confirm he was quickly, safely, immediately transported to a local regional medical hospital and strictly treated for shock. When heavily armed local police deputies eventually carefully, safely navigated back to retrieve the abandoned truck, they discovered sheer chaos. The heavy, durable steel vehicle doors were completely, entirely melted into toxic puddles, and all metal engine components were twisted. Arthur was tragically completely unable to mentally process his terrifying experience despite the massive, highly coordinated regional psychological support presence. Highly trained tracking search dogs completely, entirely lost any distinct individual scent trails near the steep edge of the woods. Law enforcement officials strongly, firmly suspected the blindly, quickly fleeing driver accidentally, entirely hallucinated the terrifying, massive, deep, dark entity. However, they absolutely could not logically, realistically explain how the heavy steel doors were completely melted by extreme high temperatures. The overwhelming, putrid atmospheric sulfur smell and the highly localized underground ground vibrations also strictly remained completely, totally, officially unsolved. Arthur completely, permanently, fully abandoned his promising commercial transport delivery plans and rapidly moved to a bustling, noisy, populated city. He completely, absolutely, strictly refused to conduct any further public media interviews regarding his terrifying, unexplainable, deep, dark road experiences. He eventually, quietly, safely wrote a highly obscure, completely anonymous internet blog detailing his intense, lingering, severe, heavy psychological trauma. Reportedly, he deeply, severely suffered from chronic daily heavy insomnia and constant terrifying nightmares featuring tall, faceless, smooth, looming entities. Dispatch logs routinely regularly show he frequently frantically called local urban police authorities, continually complaining about strange heavy mechanical vibrations. The deep, dark, isolated, unmarked mountain road remains mostly completely thoroughly abandoned and deeply heavily feared by many local residents. Experienced local rural highway patrolmen actively, aggressively, strictly discourage overly ambitious amateur novice drivers from widely exploring that specific acreage. Official public state records conflict regarding the actual total, highly accurate number of missing traveler cases strictly linked to wilderness. Some ambitious, independent amateur internet investigators occasionally dangerously completely venture into the dark, unmarked road, hoping to finally capture evidence. Most of them always safely return completely empty-handed, while a few others quickly emerge with deeply unsettling, disturbing stories. The absolute, total, complete lack of any definitive, hard physical evidence heavily, continually, profoundly frustrates those who genuinely believe Arthur. The completely destroyed internal security cameras conveniently, completely, permanently erased any potential digital visual proof of the giant outside entity. Vociferous internet online skeptics constantly, loudly, aggressively argue that sheer blind panic and total utter darkness easily successfully transformed reality. Archive notes carefully, thoroughly gathered from the official local police investigation confidently, strictly concluded that an undocumented toxic gas leaked. Yet the exact, highly specific, true physical origin nature of those massive, perfectly smooth circular tracks remains completely officially contested. University biology science experts quickly, easily, permanently dismiss the crazy, ridiculous, bizarre idea of a completely unknown, massive humanoid animal. They firmly, constantly, strongly argue that an active, healthy, massive breeding population of large hidden creatures would leave physical evidence. No unusual animal organic hair samples or strange skeletal biological bone remains have ever been definitively, positively, completely, conclusively linked. Some locals claimed the federal, national, centralized government quietly, aggressively, permanently suppressed the actual truth to secretly protect classified operations. Investigators never confirmed any grand, illegal, hidden conspiracy and simply, safely, permanently, officially closed the bizarre, terrifying, unmarked road case. Arthur constantly refuses to leave his secure concrete urban apartment whenever the winter season finally slowly descends upon the city. He strictly, violently demands that every single heavy deadbolt lock remains securely fastened throughout the entire duration of the night. The actual, absolute, terrifying truth hiding deep within those ancient, desolate Appalachian Mountains might never be completely, fully understood logically. Perhaps some dense, dark, forgotten regions of the deep American wilderness are genuinely meant to remain completely, entirely undiscovered forever. In this new story, people who went into West Virginia's woods and never came back. Many hikers believe that the deep forests of the Appalachian Range are just quiet places for weekend camping trips today. There are stories in the West Virginia mountains about travelers who walked into the trees and simply vanished forever now. This documented account follows a professional geologist who discovered a remote campsite that should not have existed at all. Gideon Vance was a 46-year-old hydrogeologist who specialized in mapping underground springs in very remote areas. He was known for his calm personality and his ability to survive in the wilderness for several weeks alone. In the spring of 2022, Gideon was hired to survey a valley near the edge of the forest. The local residents warned him about a specific ridge where the compass needles often spun in circles without any reason. Gideon did not believe in local superstitions, and he focused on the scientific data provided by his expensive digital tools. He packed his waterproof gear and hiked deep into a canyon where the cell phone signals were completely non-existent. The equipment in his heavy pack included a laser level and a high-precision digital watch that used satellite signals. He carried enough food for 7 days and a small weatherproof logbook to record his various scientific observations daily. The air in the canyon was heavy and smelled of damp moss and the ancient stone of the rising mountain. On the second morning of his trip, Gideon reached a clearing that was not marked on any of his maps. He found a canvas tent that looked like it belonged in the 1950s, sitting near a cold stone fire. There were no modern items like plastic bottles or synthetic fabrics anywhere near the small and very quiet campsite. He called out to see if anyone was nearby, but the only response was the sound of the wind through. Gideon approached the tent and noticed a cast iron skillet sitting on the rocks with fresh bacon grease inside it. He felt a sudden chill, even though the sun was shining brightly over the high ridges of the deep valley. Inside the tent, he found a wooden crate containing supplies and a tattered leather journal with yellowed and fragile pages. The handwriting was neat and described a hiking trip taken by two brothers in the summer of 1954. He noticed that the local wildlife seemed unusually quiet, which was a detail he noted in his small weather logbook. The silence of the forest seemed to press against his ears as he turned the brittle pages of the old book. The final entry was dated June 12th and mentioned a strange humming sound coming from the rocks nearby that morning. Gideon looked at the ground and saw a pair of leather boots that looked brand new despite the vintage style. He picked up a newspaper from the crate and saw the headline was from the year 1954 today. He heard a branch snap behind him and turned to see two men wearing heavy flannel shirts and denim pants. The men looked confused and asked Gideon why he was wearing such strange and brightly colored synthetic hiking clothes today. They explained that they had only been camping for 2 days and were waiting for their father to return soon. Gideon realized with a shock that these men matched the descriptions of two brothers who disappeared 70 years ago today. He checked his watch and noticed that the date on his digital screen was now flickering between different years rapidly. The brothers, whose names were Alistair and Emmett, noticed the laser level on his tripod and backed away in terror. Gideon tried to explain that he was a scientist, but his voice sounded like it was coming from far away. He felt a sense of overwhelming vertigo, as if the ground beneath his boots was turning into a gray mist. He ran back toward the main trail and did not look back at the clearing or the two lost brothers. The woods looked different in the fading light, and every tree seemed to shift its position when he turned now. When he reached his truck, he found that the police were already there searching for a missing man named Gideon. The officer named Dalton Grady told him that he had been missing for over 3 weeks in the deep woods. Gideon felt like he had only been away from his vehicle for 2 hours before he reached the main road. He checked his pack and found the leather journal from 1954 sitting right on top of his maps. The final page now had a new entry that described a man in bright orange clothes who visited their camp. Gideon never returned to that part of the West Virginia forest, and he left the geology profession shortly after that. He still dreams about the humming sound in the rocks and the smell of the fresh bacon in the woods. The mountains of West Virginia continue to hold their secrets in the deep places where time does not always move. Some structures are not built of wood and stone, but are woven into the very fabric of the passing years. If you find yourself lost in the woods near the border, you should probably keep moving until the sun comes. The ending of the tale sounds fake until you see the journal and the date written in your own hand. The truth is a shadow that follows you home from the woods and stays with you until the very end. This event remains one of the most puzzling cases in the archives of the local search and rescue teams today. Witness statements from the family members of the missing brothers confirm that the handwriting in the journal is perfectly authentic. The police files include photographs of the campsite that Gideon found, but the clearing was empty when they arrived there. They found no tent and no fire and no signs of the two brothers who had been seen by Gideon. The only evidence left behind was the journal that Gideon had taken from the wooden crate during his initial discovery. Forensic analysis of the paper showed that it was manufactured in the early 1950s, but it showed no aging. The ink was still fresh, and the leather binding had not yet developed the cracks typically found on antique books. Geologists who studied the canyon reported that the rock formations contain unusual magnetic properties that might affect local electronic devices. Some researchers believe that the humming sound Gideon heard was a result of geological pressure deep within the mountain range. Others suggest that the canyon is a place where different eras overlap for a few minutes when the weather changes. Gideon Vance spent several years trying to understand the physics of his experience, but he never found a clear answer. He often visits the county library to look at the missing persons files from the middle of the last century. He found a report about Alistair and Emmett that mentioned they were last seen carrying a heavy canvas camping tent. The photograph in the file showed two young men who were the exact same people Gideon met in the clearing. Their father had also disappeared that same week and was never found by the police or the local search parties. The case remains officially open because the bodies of the brothers were never recovered from the deep and dark woods. Gideon believes that the brothers are still in the canyon waiting for their father to return to their small camp. He often wonders if they saw him as a ghost from the future or a demon from another world entirely. The memory of their confused faces stays with him, and he can still hear their voices in his quiet mind. The forest has grown over the trails that lead to that specific coordinate, and the maps are no longer accurate. The government has restricted access to the valley, citing environmental concerns and the danger of the steep and rocky terrain. Most people who live in the area avoid the mountain and tell their children to stay away from the trees. They know that the woods can take a person and hold them for 70 years without letting them grow old. The silence of the mountain is a warning to those who think they can master the secrets of the wild. If you hear a humming sound in the rocks, you should turn around and run as fast as you. Do not look for the clearing and do not speak to the men who are wearing the flannel shirts today. The past is a dangerous place, and it does not always let you return to the present day in one fort. The ending of the story is the part that stays with you when you are walking alone in the night. The mystery is the heart of the wild, and the heart of the wild is a cold and dark. Gideon Thorne is the only witness to a truth that science cannot explain or even begin to understand fully now. The archived dispatch logs from the night of his return record a man who was terrified of his own watch. The officers who processed the report noted that Gideon appeared to have aged several years in just a few weeks. His eyes were bloodshot, and he spoke in a hurried whisper about a camp that did not exist on maps. They took his statement and filed it away with the other unexplained reports from the Appalachian Mountain range this year. The journal is kept in a safe at the university where researchers occasionally study the strange and fresh ink. No one has been able to reproduce the magnetic conditions that Gideon described in his detailed and very professional notes. The mountain continues to stand over the valley, and the fog still rolls through the trees in the morning. Some say the brothers are still there, and they are still waiting for the sun to go down today. The story of the surveyor is a warning to those who believe that time is a straight and simple line. It is a loop that can catch you and hold you in a moment that never ends or begins. The woods of West Virginia are deep, and they are very old, and they do not like to be. The ending of the story sounds fake until you stand in the fog and hear the sound of the rocks. The truth is in the journal, and the journal is in the safe, and the safe is in the forest is waiting for the next person to lose their way in the mist of the high ridges. The tale is told, and the listener is warned, and the cabin is waiting in the deep and dark. The story of Gideon Vance is a legacy of the unknown in the heart of the great American wild. The ending is the part that stays with you when you turn off the light at the end day. The mystery is the ending, and the ending is the mystery in the quiet woods of the mountain range. The story is finished, and the forest is dark, and the mountains are silent, and the truth is free. The geologist is home, and the camp is gone, and the brothers are waiting for their father to return soon. The ending is the beginning of the next story, in the heart of the great and ancient mountain wild. The tale of the man who saw the past in the present is done for now in the woods are calling, and the fog is rolling, and the mystery is yours to keep for a long. The ending is the silence that follows the final word of the story of the lost and the truth. The truth is a shadow in the trees, and the trees are the only ones who know the secrets. The story is done, and the fire is out, and the dark is all that remains in the fire. The forensic evidence of the journal remains the only physical proof that the brothers were ever seen after 1954. Handwriting experts compared the new entry to the older pages and found they were written by the same person. This would mean that the boy from the past wrote about Gideon in the future with the same pen today. The local sheriff continues to keep the case on his desk because it is the only one he cannot solve. He looks at the vintage boots in the evidence room and wonders how they could stay so clean and new. The valley is a place where the air stays still and the seasons do not follow the normal calendar cycles. Gideon Vance never went back to the mountains, and he never looked at another digital watch for his entire life. He preferred the steady ticking of an old mechanical clock that stayed in the present moment with him at home. The story of the disappearance is told in hushed tones by the residents of the nearby mountain town of Blackwood. They know that the woods are not just trees and rocks, but are a living part of the local Blackwood. The mystery is a gift for those who listen to the whispers of the wild and the hidden places now. The ending of the tale is the part you will remember when you are walking alone in the forest. The story is a circle, and the circle is a map, and the map leads back to the start. The truth is a fire that burns in the heart of the dark and the silence of the mountain. What people reported deep in Appalachia still doesn't make sense. Deep inside the treacherous, isolated mountains of West Virginia, a routine geological survey quickly became a completely unexplained mystery. During the cold autumn of 2014, two experienced professionals vanished while thoroughly mapping highly unstable regional terrain. What local search teams eventually uncovered safely completely defies any logical scientific explanation or basic realistic human survival instincts. Archive notes from the massive official investigation describe a highly disturbing timeline of events that still haunts local authorities. 40-year-old William Vance worked as a dedicated structural engineer, assessing old abandoned coal mines' structural integrity safely. His capable working partner was a 32-year-old soil specialist named Elias, who actively mapped erosion patterns. Their primary professional objective required them to camp safely deep inside the Appalachian wilderness, far away from civilian roads. The county file from 2009 actually mentioned several highly unstable, dangerous sinkholes forming throughout that exact region. They arrived on November 2nd and immediately began carefully setting up their heavy technical equipment near a dark ravine. The first quiet, freezing night passed entirely without any significant dangerous incidents, as the exhausted researchers slept heavily outdoors. State records confirm that severe, scattered winter storms unexpectedly bypassed their specific elevation despite highly ominous regional weather predictions. However, Elias woke up shortly after midnight because he clearly heard strange, heavy scraping sounds near the steep ridge. He initially assumed a curious, hungry black bear was aggressively investigating their sealed, waterproof food containers near the trees. When he cautiously shined his heavy flashlight directly outside, the heavy metallic scraping sounds instantly ceased in the darkness. William quickly discovered a highly bizarre set of massive, deep indentations in the freezing soil the following foggy morning. The strange, unexplainable deep tracks were perfectly circular in shape, and they sank nearly 5 inches into solid dirt. Some locals claimed a rogue commercial mining outfit operated illegally nearby, but investigators never confirmed those specific wild rumors. William carefully photographed the bizarre, freezing, muddy footprints and noted that the stride length indicated a massive, heavy machine. He calmly, rationally theorized that some unknown automated logging equipment might have dangerously crossed their remote territory completely overnight. The highly stressful situation escalated drastically during their second dark night when an awful chemical smell suddenly arrived there. Reportedly, the foul, suffocating odor tightly resembled burning synthetic plastic mixed heavily with the sharp scent of raw sulfur. Both dedicated researchers immediately woke up, coughing violently and aggressively struggling to breathe properly inside their small sealed tents. Elias quickly grabbed his emergency satellite radio to call for immediate outside medical assistance, but only received aggressive static. Dispatch logs show no emergency distress calls were ever successfully officially recorded by the regional ranger station that month. Suddenly, a massive, unseen, heavy physical force violently shook the solid ground and partially collapsed their rigid tent frame. William scrambled frantically into the dark, open clearing and desperately aimed his high-powered thermal imaging camera pointing upward. The glowing digital screen instantly revealed an enormous, intense heat signature standing perfectly still behind a large dead pine. The strange glowing thermal image lacked any discernible biological features and completely blocked the normal ambient background radiation signatures. Records conflict regarding exactly how long they silently, terrifyingly watched the imposing bright anomaly before it slowly, finally retreated. Morning light quickly, clearly revealed that their specialized digital navigation equipment was completely shattered into tiny, useless, broken pieces. William frantically, urgently insisted they absolutely needed to abandon their remaining camping gear and hike toward the main highway. Elias completely strongly agreed, but they soon realized their backup analog compasses were constantly displaying completely erratic magnetic headings. They were effectively hopelessly, completely lost in a massive, unforgiving wilderness region known for permanently disorienting, highly experienced survivalists. The desperate, anxious engineers decided to blindly, consistently follow the slow river current, hoping it safely intersected a road. They hiked for 12 grueling, painful hours through thick, thorny underbrush while constantly feeling intensely, directly, violently watched closely. Archived notes from Elias stated he repeatedly caught brief, terrifying glimpses of pale, smooth, large objects moving swiftly nearby. Every single time he abruptly stopped to firmly point out the hidden observer, the pale, unknown shapes instantly vanished. Utter physical exhaustion eventually heavily forced them to quickly establish a completely vulnerable, unprotected makeshift camp by the water. They huddled tightly, safely together by a small, warm fire while strongly clutching their sturdy walking sticks for protection. Around 2 in the freezing morning, the surrounding dark, dense woods suddenly fell totally dead silent as insects stopped. A deep, guttural, mechanical humming sound slowly, continuously began to violently vibrate through the damp dirt beneath their boots. Some locals claimed strange underground natural gas releases occasionally plagued the Appalachian region, but geologists officially found no evidence. William frantically, aggressively scanned the pitch-black distant tree line with his thermal camera, but the expensive battery exploded. Elias screamed out loudly in absolute, sheer, unadulterated terror when a tall, pale, smooth shape casually stepped into the firelight. The towering, featureless, pale entity did not overtly, aggressively attack them, but simply stood motionless, completely staring blankly ahead. William slowly, hesitantly reached for his heavy orange flare gun, but his frozen, numb fingers were constantly trembling violently. The bizarre, towering, unknown creature emitted another deep, deafening humming vocalization that violently, instantly extinguished the warm campfire flames. Plunged into total, suffocating, pitch-black darkness, the two terrified close friends blindly, frantically ran into the treacherous woods. They hopelessly, blindly sprinted continuously through the dense, tangled brush until they eventually physically separated from each other forever. A commercial timber survey operator miraculously happily found Elias wandering aimlessly near a heavily designated rural gravel access channel. The young, traumatized soil specialist was severely badly dehydrated and suffering from multiple minor bleeding lacerations caused by branches. State records confirm he was quickly, safely, immediately transported to a local regional medical hospital and strictly chemically treated. When heavily armed local police deputies eventually carefully navigated back to retrieve the abandoned campsite, they discovered sheer chaos. The heavy, durable canvas sleeping tents were completely, entirely melted into toxic puddles, and all metal hand tools twisted. William was tragically completely never seen again, despite the massive, highly coordinated regional search effort spanning 3 adjacent counties. Highly trained tracking search dogs completely, entirely lost his distinct individual scent trail near the steep edge of cliffs. Law enforcement officials strongly, firmly suspected the blindly, quickly fleeing engineer accidentally fatally fell into the massive dark sinkhole. However, they absolutely could not logically, realistically explain how the heavy camping equipment was completely melted by extreme temperatures. The overwhelming, putrid atmospheric sulfur smell and the highly localized underground ground vibrations also strictly remained completely, totally unsolved. Elias completely, permanently, fully abandoned his promising scientific soil mapping career and rapidly moved to a bustling, noisy city. He completely, absolutely, strictly refused to conduct any further public media interviews regarding his terrifying, unexplainable deep forest experiences. He eventually, quietly, safely wrote a highly obscure, completely anonymous internet blog detailing his intense, lingering, severe psychological trauma. Reportedly, he deeply severely suffered from chronic, daily heavy insomnia and constant terrifying nightmares featuring tall, faceless, smooth entities. Dispatch logs routinely regularly show he frequently frantically called local urban police authorities, continually complaining about strange, heavy vibrations. The deep, dark West Virginia forests remain mostly completely, thoroughly uncharted and deeply, heavily feared by many veteran guides. Experienced local rural tour operators actively, aggressively, strictly discourage overly ambitious amateur novice tourists from widely exploring that area. Official public state records conflict regarding the actual, total, highly accurate number of missing persons cases linked to wilderness. Some ambitious, independent, amateur internet investigators occasionally, dangerously, completely venture into the dark region, hoping to finally capture evidence. Most of them always safely return completely empty-handed, while a few others quickly emerge with deeply unsettling stories. The absolute, total, complete lack of any definitive, hard physical evidence heavily, continually, profoundly frustrates those who believe Elias. The destroyed, shattered digital thermal camera conveniently, completely, permanently erased any potential digital visual proof of the giant signature. Vociferous internet online skeptics constantly, loudly, aggressively argue that sheer blind panic and total utter darkness easily transformed reality. Archived notes, carefully, thoroughly gathered from the official local police investigation, confidently, strictly concluded that an undocumented gas leaked. Yet, the exact, highly specific, true physical origin nature of those massive, perfectly smooth circular tracks remains completely contested. University biology science experts quickly, easily, permanently dismiss the crazy, ridiculous, bizarre idea of a completely unknown massive animal. They firmly, constantly, strongly argue that an active, healthy, massive breeding population of large hidden creatures would leave evidence. No unusual animal organic hair samples or strange skeletal biological bone remains have ever been definitively, positively, conclusively linked. Some locals claimed the federal national centralized government quietly, aggressively, permanently suppressed the actual truth to secretly protect operations. Investigators never confirmed any grand, illegal, hidden conspiracy and simply, safely, permanently, officially closed the bizarre, terrifying Appalachian case. The Whispering Ridges of Blackwood Canyon. The eastern slopes of the mountain range remained largely unmapped during the late 19th century, attracting only the most resilient timber cruisers and surveyors. In the autumn of roughly 80 years ago, a team of 4 experienced land surveyors established a base camp in a deep, heavily forested valley known locally as Blackwood Canyon. Their objective was to plot the boundaries of a proposed timber reserve, a task requiring them to spend several weeks in total isolation from the nearest settlement. The environment was characterized by dense stands of old-growth Douglas fir, steep rocky terrain, and a silence so profound that the men initially remarked on the complete absence of typical forest sounds. By the 4th day of the expedition, the routine nature of their work began to shift. as a series of unexplained auditory sensations disrupted the camp. The men reported hearing what sounded like distant, rhythmic chanting that seemed to emanate directly from the stone walls of the canyon rather than from any distinct physical source. The lead surveyor, a veteran of wilderness campaigns named Thomas Albright, noted in his logs that the sounds did not align with any known wildlife or geological activity. The noises typically began just after sundown, starting as a low-frequency hum that vibrated through the ground before transitioning into distinct, modulated cadences resembling human speech. When the crew attempted to trace the sound, they found that its apparent direction shifted constantly, making it impossible to pinpoint an origin point. The younger members of the crew, including a transit operator named Edward Lynn, expressed growing discomfort, describing a sensation of intense pressure in their ears whenever the chanting commenced. Despite their unease, the team maintained their daily schedule, attributing the phenomenon to unusual wind currents passing through the narrow rock formations higher up the ridge. However, the lack of any significant wind during those chilly, still autumn nights quickly complicated that rationalization. As the first week drew to a close, the auditory disturbances escalated from distant hums to loud, distinct vocalizations that appeared to occur much closer to the perimeter of their camp. On the night of October 12th, all four men awoke simultaneously to the sound of a single, sustained note that seemed to vibrate the very canvas of their tents. Albright exited his tent with a lantern, but found nothing in the surrounding woods except for a peculiar, localized mist that hung low to the ground despite a clear sky overhead. The camp dog, a large retriever known for its reliable tracking instincts, refused to leave the shelter of the supply wagon and spent the remaining hours of the night whimpering. The next morning, the crew discovered that their brass surveying instruments, which had been securely locked in wooden cases, were completely out of alignment, their delicate internal needles pointing wildly away from magnetic north. The psychological toll of the continuous, unexplained noise began to manifest in the behavior of the crew members, who reported experiencing vivid, recurring dreams of vast subterranean spaces. Lynn, in particular, became increasingly obsessed with the idea that the sounds were a form of communication, spending his evening hours sitting at the edge of the firelight, listening intently to the darkness. His journals from that week contained frantic attempts to transcribe the phonetic patterns of the chanting, resulting in pages of repetitive, nonsensical symbols that bore no resemblance to any known language. The other men attempted to dissuade him from his isolation, but a growing sense of irritability and mutual suspicion began to fracture the group dynamic. The shared perception of an unseen, listening presence in the valley created an atmosphere of pervasive dread that made sleep nearly impossible. By mid-October, the weather turned sharply colder, bringing heavy frost but no wind to explain the persistent acoustic phenomena. The team decided to accelerate their fieldwork in order to leave the canyon ahead of schedule, working longer hours in the rugged upper terrain. During these daytime excursions, the men began to experience sensory distortions, reporting that the forest appeared strangely flat and devoid of color, as if a thick veil had been drawn over the landscape. They also noted that their perception of time seemed heavily altered, with hours passing in what felt like mere moments, or conversely, a single afternoon stretching out into an agonizingly long ordeal. On several occasions, members of the party became momentarily separated in wide-open clearings, only to find themselves completely disoriented and unable to locate their companions who were standing less than 50 yards away. The peak incident occurred on the night of October 20th, during a period of total atmospheric stillness. The chanting, which had been absent during the day, returned with an unprecedented intensity that made conversation within the camp impossible without shouting. According to later accounts collected from the survivors, the sound did not seem to travel through the air, but rather originated from within their own skulls, creating an intense throbbing sensation behind their eyes. At approximately midnight, Lin abruptly stood up from his bed, walked past his companions without speaking, and strode directly into the unlit forest toward the steepest section of the canyon wall. Albright and the remaining crew grabbed lanterns and pursued him immediately, but the dense undergrowth and the overwhelming nature of the sound severely hindered their progress through the dark. They followed the sound of Lin crashing through the brush until they reached the base of a massive, sheer cliff face where the acoustic vibrations were so intense that the lantern glass began to shatter. Through the dim, flickering light of the remaining lanterns, the men observed Lin standing motionless against the rock, his head tilted back as if looking toward the summit. When Albright approached to pull him away, Lin turned around, exhibiting a state of profound shock, his eyes wide and completely unblinking. He insisted that the wall of rock was no longer solid, but rather a vast opening leading into a brightly lit space filled with moving figures. The other crew members saw only the solid gray expanse of limestone, but the discrepancy in their perceptions caused an immediate, panicked retreat back to the main camp. The following morning, the team abandoned the majority of their heavy equipment and began a rapid descent out of Blackwood Canyon, determined to reach the nearest logging outpost. Lin remained in a catatonic state during the entire trek, requiring physical assistance to walk and showing no awareness of his surroundings. The remaining three men were plagued by a persistent ringing in their ears and a deep physical exhaustion that did not subside even after they exited the valley. Upon reaching safety, the surveyors underwent medical evaluations where doctors noted that all four men exhibited symptoms typically associated with extreme prolonged exposure to low-frequency vibrations, including inner ear damage and severe cognitive disorientation. An official investigation into the incident was launched by the Regional Surveying Office, primarily to recover the expensive abandoned equipment and to verify the claims made by the crew. A secondary team of surveyors, accompanied by two local law enforcement officers, entered Blackwood Canyon 3 weeks after the original party had fled. They located the base camp intact, though they noted that the surrounding vegetation showed unusual signs of localized desiccation, with leaves and pine needles scorched as if subjected to intense heat, despite no evidence of an actual fire. The brass instruments were recovered from their boxes, but examiners later determined that their metal components had become permanently demagnetized, rendering them completely useless for future geographic work. The second expedition experienced none of the acoustic phenomena reported by Albright's crew, finding the valley to be entirely quiet and unremarkable. They concluded that the original team had likely suffered from a form of collective hysteria brought on by the extreme isolation, poor rations, and the deceptive echoes common to narrow, rocky canyons. This environmental explanation, however, failed to satisfy the men who had lived through the experience, particularly given the permanent physical changes they suffered. Lin never fully recovered his faculties and spent the remainder of his life in a private sanitarium where he continued to insist until his death that a part of his mind had remained behind inside the stone walls of the ridge. The case of Blackwood Canyon was eventually archived in regional historical records as a curious footnote in the mapping of the territory, largely forgotten by the public. Modern researchers who have examined the surviving logs and medical reports suggest that the valley may possess unique geological features capable of producing infrasound, which can cause hallucinations, anxiety, and physiological distress in humans. Others point to the possibility of localized pocket emissions of natural gases that could distort perception and cause collective neurological symptoms. To this day, the exact nature of what the surveyors encountered in that isolated valley remains unresolved, leaving behind only the eerie, unsettling testimonies of the men who heard the ridge's whisper. The lingering questions surrounding the event continued to discourage further development in Blackwood Canyon for decades after the survey team's disastrous expedition. Local logging companies found that workers were highly reluctant to enter the valley, citing the old stories of the chanting and the psychological breakdown of the surveyors. Even when high-quality timber became scarce in adjacent areas, the canyon remained untouched, preserved by a reputation that time did not seem to dim. The few independent trappers who ventured near the perimeter of the valley in the early 20th century reported that the local wildlife appeared to avoid the deep interior of the canyon, preferring the more open, less oppressive terrain of the outer slopes. In the late 1950s, a university geology department attempted to conduct a comprehensive acoustic survey of the region to either confirm or disprove the infrasound hypothesis permanently. The researchers set up highly sensitive recording devices at various elevations along the canyon walls, hoping to capture any low-frequency vibrations generated by the unique rock formations. During their 2-week stay, the instruments recorded several instances of unusual seismic microtremors, but no significant acoustic anomalies were detected that matched the descriptions in Albright's journals. The study concluded that while the canyon's shape could theoretically amplify certain sounds, there was no contemporary evidence of any ongoing, unexplained phenomena active in the area. Despite the scientific community's skepticism, the private papers of Thomas Albright, which were donated to a regional historical society by his descendants, offer a much more personal and unsettling view of the aftermath. In his later years, Albright became a recluse, refusing to travel anywhere near mountainous terrain and keeping his home illuminated at all times of the night. His personal diaries reveal that he remained convinced until his final days that the phenomenon they encountered was not a product of the wind or gas, but something inherent to the location itself. He wrote extensively about the difficulty of adjusting to normal life when the memory of that absolute vibrating silence continued to echo in his mind, undermining his confidence in the physical world. The story of the Blackwood Canyon incident survives today primarily within the specialized archives of regional folklore and historical geography societies, away from mainstream media attention. It serves as a stark reminder of the limits of early exploration and the profound psychological effects that the deep wilderness can inflict on those who attempt to measure it. The unresolved discrepancy between the physical evidence of damaged equipment and the subjective horror experienced by the surveyors ensures that the valley retains its enigmatic status. Whether the events were caused by an undiscovered natural mechanism or a temporary distortion of human perception, the canyon remains a place where the boundary between reality and the unexplained became terrifyingly thin for 4 forgotten men. In this new story, quiet California urban legends that people still whisper about at night. In 2022, state records from a coastal county in California detailed a series of strange occurrences involving hikers. Local authorities reportedly investigated multiple claims of unidentified figures moving through the dense fog during the early morning hours near Big Sur. These archived notes suggest that several individuals vanished without a trace while walking along the well-marked trails of the region. Investigators never confirmed any foul play, yet some locals claim that certain sections of the forest should remain completely avoided. The official dispatch logs indicate that search parties found only abandoned equipment left behind by the missing people during late autumn. Mark was a 34-year-old park ranger who worked specifically within the rugged terrain of the Central Coast. His daily job required him to monitor wildlife patterns and maintain the safety of the various trails used by seasonal tourists. He arrived at the remote observation station with the goal of documenting local coyote populations for a state-funded study. Records conflict regarding his exact location during the final hours of his shift before he failed to check in officially. The county file from 2009 mentions that no distress signal was ever received from his standard-issue radio equipment. Mark reportedly left his official vehicle parked at the trailhead with the engine still running and the driver door open. The search team discovered a set of footprints that appeared to lead directly into a solid wall of thick brush. Archive notes from the investigation describe how the tracks stopped abruptly, as if the person had simply vanished into thin air. State records indicate that the soil around the tracks showed no signs of a struggle or any other human presence. Investigators never confirmed if the footprints belonged to Mark or if another person had been walking in that specific area. The county file from 2009 remains one of the most puzzling cases for the local sheriff department to solve. Some locals claimed that they heard a metallic tapping sound coming from the canyon for several nights after he disappeared. Sarah was a 28-year-old freelance photographer who traveled to the area to capture the unique natural light. She spent most of her time near the cliff edges where the Pacific Ocean meets the rocky shoreline of Northern California. Her purpose for being in the location was to complete a series of images for a prestigious travel magazine project. Sarah reportedly told her friends that she felt a strange sensation of being watched while she was taking her photographs. State records show that her last social media post was a photo of the ocean taken at 4 in the afternoon. The image appears to show a dark shape standing just behind a cluster of trees on the edge of the cliff. Dispatch logs reveal that several residents called the police to report a woman screaming near the beach that same evening. Investigators never confirmed the source of the screams, and they found no evidence of any person being in distress there. Archive notes describe how her car was found, with the keys still in the ignition and her wallet on the seat. Some locals claimed that the coastal fog can play tricks on the ears and make the wind sound like human voices. State records from 2023 indicate that a commercial diver found a small piece of blue fabric near the rocks. This fabric reportedly matched the color of the jacket Sarah was wearing on the day that she was last seen alive. The small-town residents often speak about a third individual named David, who was a 40-year-old local historian. David spent many years collecting old maps of the Sierra Nevada mountains to find the location of the lost village. The county file from 2009 includes a map that he had hand-drawn with several red circles on it. State records show that he purchased a large amount of survival gear just 2 days before he left for his trip. Some locals claimed that David believed the lost village was protected by people who did not want to be found. Investigators never confirmed if he reached his destination, but they found his empty tent near a remote mountain stream. Archive notes mention that the tent was torn from the inside as if something was trying to get out quickly. A local rancher reportedly told the sheriff that he saw a group of men dressed in dark clothing near the stream. Dispatch logs from 2015 indicate that the rancher was considered a reliable witness by the local authorities at the time. State records show that the men were never identified and they seem to have no connection to the nearby towns. Records conflict regarding whether the men were carrying tools or if they were simply walking through the dense forest area. Investigators never confirmed if these men were related to the disappearance of David or the other missing hikers in California. The county file from 2009 mentions that several other historians had disappeared in the same region over decades. Some locals claimed that there are secret tunnels under the mountains that date back to the time of the gold rush. State records indicate that no such tunnels have ever been officially discovered by geologists or by any modern survey teams. Archived notes from 2012 describe a series of low-frequency vibrations that were recorded by seismic sensors in the area. Investigators never confirmed the cause of these vibrations, but they noted that the local wildlife became very agitated and loud. Records conflict on whether these events are linked to the urban legends that continue to haunt the rural coastal towns. Another report in the dispatch logs from 2019 describes a driver who claimed to see a transparent figure on Highway 1. The driver was a 50-year-old long-haul trucker who had been working the California routes for 20 years. He reportedly saw a person standing in the middle of the road during a heavy rainstorm near the Big Sur Bridge. State records show that he slammed on his brakes, but there was no impact and no body was ever found. Investigators never confirmed if the trucker was suffering from fatigue or if he truly saw something on the lonely road. Archived notes from the Highway Patrol mention that 3 other drivers reported the same figure during that specific weekend. Some locals claimed that the figure is a woman who vanished from a nearby resort during the summer of 1990. Records conflict regarding her name, but the county file from 2009 contains a missing person report from that era. State records indicate that she was a 42-year-old tourist from Oregon who was visiting the coast alone. Dispatch logs from 1990 show that her hotel room was left exactly as if she intended to return shortly. Investigators never confirmed any leads in her case, and the file was eventually moved to the cold case department for review. The archive notes mention that her footprints were found leading away from the resort and into the deep ocean water. In 2021, a group of researchers found a set of old keys buried in the sand near the cliffs. The county file from 2009 lists these keys as a possible match for a car owned by David. State records show that the keys were heavily corroded, but they still functioned when they were tested on a similar lock. Some locals claimed that finding the keys was a sign that the missing people are still present in the area. Investigators never confirmed this theory, and the keys were placed into an evidence locker for further study by forensic teams. Archived notes from the lab report indicate that there was no usable DNA found on the surface of the metal. Dispatch logs from the winter of 2024 mention a series of strange phone calls to the local police station. The callers reportedly heard nothing but heavy breathing and the sound of waves crashing against the rocks on the line. State records show that these calls were traced back to a phone booth that had been disconnected for 15 years. Investigators never confirmed how a disconnected phone could make outgoing calls to the emergency dispatch center during the middle of the night. Records conflict on whether this was a technical glitch in the aging phone system or a series of deliberate pranks. Some locals claimed that the calls always happen on the anniversary of the major disappearances in the coastal region. Archive notes from a retired sheriff detail his personal belief that the geography of California hides many secrets from the public. He reportedly spent his retirement years cataloging the various urban legends and mapping them against the official state records of incidents. The county file from 2009 contains a letter he wrote to the governor regarding the high number of cases. State records show that the governor never responded to the letter, and the sheriff passed away in 2021. Investigators never confirmed if his research had any merit or if he was simply an old man with too much time. Some locals claimed that his private journals were taken by men in dark suits after his funeral ended. Records conflict regarding the contents of those journals, but some believe they contained the truth about the missing people of California. Archive notes from a local librarian suggest that the sheriff had found a pattern in the dates of the disappearances. State records show that most of the events occur during the transition between the spring and the summer seasons each year. Dispatch logs from 2025 indicate that 2 more hikers have gone missing near the same coastal trail system. Investigators never confirmed if these new cases are related to the historical legends that have been told for many years. Some locals claimed that the forest is slowly expanding and reclaiming the land that was once occupied by the settlers. The county file from 2009 remains a primary source of information for those who seek to understand these events. State records will continue to document the facts, while the urban legends will continue to grow in the quiet coastal towns. Archived notes from the investigation suggest that the truth may never be fully known by the authorities or the public. Investigators never confirmed any supernatural activity, but the data they collected remains difficult to explain using only modern scientific methods. Records conflict on the final count of people who have vanished into the fog of the Northern California coastline. Some locals claimed that if you listen closely to the wind, you can still hear the voices of the missing. The strange things that happened during those June nights. Deep within the heavy, humid swamps of southern Louisiana, an isolated botanical expedition encountered something entirely unexplained. During the sweltering hot summer of 2017, 2 highly dedicated researchers established a remote camp. What they recorded over 3 continuous, terrifying nights remains a highly contested mystery among local authorities today. Archived notes from their official state investigation reveal a disturbing timeline that defies simple, logical, scientific explanation. Mark was a 32-year-old professional field botanist tasked with documenting rare endangered swamp orchids. His capable working partner was a 29-year-old highly experienced wildlife photographer named Lisa. Their primary scientific objective required them to camp deep inside the remote bayou away from established trails. The official county file from 2009 mentioned highly unusual animal migration patterns throughout that region. They safely arrived on June 12th and immediately began setting up their heavy equipment near dark water. The first quiet night passed without any significant dangerous incidents as the thoroughly exhausted researchers slept soundly. State records confirm that severe scattered thunderstorms unexpectedly bypassed their specific location despite highly ominous weather predictions. However, Lisa woke up shortly after midnight because she heard strange, heavy splashing sounds near the bank. She initially assumed a curious large alligator was investigating their sealed waterproof containers near the muddy shore. When she cautiously shined her heavy flashlight outside, the heavy splashing sounds instantly ceased in the darkness. Mark quickly discovered a series of massive, deep indentations in the damp soil the following humid morning. The strange, deep tracks were vaguely humanoid in shape, but they sank nearly 4 inches into mud. Some locals claimed a rogue commercial trapping outfit operated illegally nearby, but investigators never confirmed those rumors. Mark carefully photographed the bizarre muddy footprints and noted that the stride length indicated a tall creature. He calmly rationalized that rapidly rising swamp water might have dangerously distorted ordinary wild animal tracks overnight. The highly stressful situation escalated drastically during their second dark night when an awful chemical smell arrived. Reportedly, the foul, suffocating odor resembled rotting meat mixed heavily with the sharp scent of raw sulfur. Both dedicated researchers immediately woke up coughing violently and struggling to breathe properly inside their small tents. Lisa quickly grabbed her emergency satellite radio to call for immediate outside assistance, but only received static. Dispatch logs show no emergency distress calls were ever successfully recorded by the regional ranger station then. Suddenly, a massive, unseen heavy force violently shook the solid ground and collapsed the aluminum tent frame. Mark scrambled frantically into the dark open clearing and desperately aimed his high-powered thermal imaging camera. The glowing digital screen instantly revealed an enormous, intense heat signature standing perfectly still behind a cypress. The strange, glowing thermal image lacked any discernible biological features and completely blocked the ambient background radiation. Records conflict regarding exactly how long they silently watched the imposing bright anomaly before it slowly retreated. Morning light quickly revealed that their specialized digital navigation equipment was completely shattered into tiny, useless pieces. Mark frantically insisted they absolutely needed to abandon their remaining camping gear and hike toward the highway. Lisa completely agreed, but they soon realized their backup analog compasses were displaying erratic magnetic directional headings. They were effectively hopelessly lost in a massive, unforgiving wilderness region known for disorienting, highly experienced survivalists. The desperate, anxious botanists decided to blindly follow the slow river current, hoping it intersected a road. They hiked for 12 grueling, painful hours through thick, thorny underbrush while constantly feeling intensely directly watched. Archived notes from Lisa stated she repeatedly caught brief, terrifying glimpses of pale, smooth objects moving swiftly. Every single time she abruptly stopped to point out the hidden observer, the pale, unknown shapes vanished. Utter physical exhaustion eventually forced them to establish a completely vulnerable, unprotected makeshift camp by the water. They huddled tightly together by a small, warm fire while clutching their sturdy walking sticks for protection. Around 2 in the morning, the surrounding dark, dense woods suddenly fell dead silent as insects stopped. A deep, guttural, mechanical humming sound slowly began to vibrate through the damp dirt beneath their boots. Some locals claimed strange underground natural gas releases occasionally plagued the region, but geologists found no evidence. Mark frantically scanned the pitch-black distant tree line with his thermal camera, but the battery exploded. Lisa screamed loudly in absolute terror when a tall, pale, smooth shape casually stepped into the firelight. The towering, featureless, pale entity did not aggressively attack them, but simply stood motionless, staring blankly ahead. Mark slowly reached for his heavy orange flare gun, but his frozen, numb fingers were trembling violently. The bizarre, towering, unknown creature emitted another deep, deafening, humming vocalization that violently extinguished the campfire flames. Plunged into total suffocating pitch darkness, the two terrified close friends blindly ran into the treacherous swamp. They hopelessly sprinted blindly through the dense, tangled brush until they eventually separated from each other forever. A commercial swamp airboat tour operator miraculously found Lisa wandering aimlessly near a designated access channel. The young, traumatized photographer was severely dehydrated and suffering from multiple minor lacerations caused by sharp branches. State records confirm she was immediately transported to a local regional medical hospital and strictly treated. When heavily armed police deputies eventually navigated back to retrieve the abandoned campsite, they discovered sheer chaos. The heavy, durable canvas tents were completely melted into toxic puddles, and all metal hand tools twisted. Mark was tragically never seen again, despite the massive, coordinated regional search effort spanning 3 adjacent parishes. Highly trained search dogs completely lost his distinct individual scent trail near the edge of a deep bog. Law enforcement officials strongly suspected the blindly fleeing botanist accidentally fell into the massive, dark, deep sinkhole. However, they could not realistically explain how the heavy camping equipment was melted by extreme temperatures. The overwhelming putrid atmospheric sulfur smell and the localized underground ground vibrations also remained totally unsolved. Lisa permanently abandoned her promising wildlife photography career and moved to a bustling, noisy urban city. She absolutely refused to conduct any further public media interviews regarding her terrifying, unexplainable swamp experiences. She eventually quietly wrote a highly obscure anonymous internet blog detailing her intense, lingering psychological mental trauma. Reportedly, she deeply suffered from severe chronic daily insomnia and constant terrifying nightmares featuring tall, faceless entities. Dispatch logs routinely show she frequently called local urban police authorities complaining about strange, heavy mechanical vibrations. The deep, dark Louisiana swamps remain mostly completely uncharted and thoroughly feared by many veteran guides. Experienced local boat tour operators aggressively discourage overly ambitious amateur novice tourists from exploring that bayou. Official public records conflict regarding the actual total accurate number of missing persons cases linked to wilderness. Some ambitious, independent amateur internet investigators occasionally dangerously venture into the region, hoping to finally capture evidence. Most of them always return completely empty-handed, while a few others emerge with deeply unsettling stories. The absolute total lack of any definitive, hard physical evidence continually frustrates those who believe Lisa. The destroyed, shattered thermal camera completely erased any potential digital visual proof of the giant signature. Vociferous internet skeptics constantly loudly argue that sheer blind panic and total darkness easily transformed a bear. Archive notes carefully gathered from the official police investigation confidently concluded that an undocumented toxic gas leaked. Yet, the exact, specific, true origin nature of those massive, perfectly smooth footprints remains a contested topic. University biology experts easily dismiss the crazy, ridiculous idea of a completely unknown massive swamp animal. They constantly argue that an active, healthy breeding population of large, hidden creatures would leave evidence. No unusual animal hair samples or strange skeletal bone remains have ever been definitively, positively, conclusively linked. Some locals claimed the federal national government quietly, aggressively suppressed the actual truth to secretly protect operations. Official government investigators never confirmed any grand illegal conspiracy and simply permanently closed the bizarre swamp case. What happened in this Appalachian ghost town still terrifies locals today. A freezing rain began to fall over the remote coal valley of Cinder Creek on the ninth night of October 1982. Local dispatch logs later showed that three separate emergency calls were placed from the mountain community within a 10-minute window. Each caller reported hearing a low and rhythmic thumping sound that seemed to vibrate directly through their living room floors. State records from that weekend indicated that the state police sent two troopers to investigate the unusual disturbance. When the officers arrived at the valley entrance, they found a deserted highway and a town that was completely dark. The local authorities never found a definitive explanation for why an entire community abandoned their homes in a single hour. Gideon Vance was a 38-year-old timber cruiser who spent his days assessing hardwood forests in Western Virginia. He had lived near the mouth of Cinder Creek his entire life and knew the steep mountain paths by heart. On that particular dreary morning, his only goal was to evaluate a dense stand of white oak near the ridgeline. He packed his iron-marking axe and a worn leather field journal into the cab of his four-wheel drive truck. The morning air smelled strongly of wet coal dust and decaying leaves as he started his slow ascent up the mountain. He expected a routine day of measuring trunk diameters and noting boundary markers through the heavy mountain mist. By 4 in the afternoon, a dense and suffocating fog began to roll through the deep gaps in the mountain ridge. Gideon noticed that his pocket watch had stopped ticking entirely, which was highly unusual for a reliable mechanical timepiece. He packed his gear early and decided to walk back down toward the settlement before the mountain trail became treacherous. As he emerged from the tree line above the valley, he noticed that the entire town was shrouded in complete darkness. The streetlights were completely dead, and not a single window showed the warm glow of a lamp or a television screen. He quickened his pace down the gravel road to check on his neighbors at the local store. Gideon parked his truck outside the Cinder Creek General Store and walked up the creaking wooden steps to the front door. The air was deathly quiet, and the only sound was the steady dripping of rain from the rusted tin roof drainage. He pushed the door open and found the interior completely undisturbed, with the cash register drawer still closed tightly. A pot of fresh coffee was sitting on the cold burner, and several open ledgers were scattered across the counter. He shouted into the back storage room, but his voice only produced a faint echo against the unpainted wooden walls. He noticed that every single house along the main road had its front door swung wide open to the storm. County files from 1982 later revealed that the state troopers found 24 vehicles left parked in their driveways. Gideon walked into the small valley schoolhouse and discovered that the children had left their woolen coats hanging on the wall. A charcoal chalkboard in the main classroom still displayed a spelling lesson that was dated for that exact Monday morning. He discovered several domestic pets wandering aimlessly through the muddy alleys, but there was no sign of their owners anywhere. The entire settlement felt like an open grave where a vibrant community had suddenly vanished without a single cry. He drove to the neighboring county seat to report the massive and inexplicable abandonment to the state authorities. He spent the next 4 days working alongside state investigators who arrived to secure the eerie and silent perimeter. Gideon used his intimate knowledge of the timber tracks to help the search teams systematically comb the surrounding mountain ridges. They found no signs of violence, no broken windows, and absolutely no footprints leading into the dense laurel thickets. Witness statements from a nearby logging camp indicated that no vehicles had passed through the valley road since the previous evening. A state police investigator named Silas Vance found a bizarre detail inside the abandoned rail depot at the edge of town. Some locals from the next valley claimed that the ground had been trembling for days before the disappearance. Silas discovered a series of deep fractures in the earth that ran directly parallel to the old iron railroad tracks. Gideon helped the investigator measure the deep fissures, which emitted a faint and bitter odor that smelled like sulfur. They found dozens of abandoned flashlights and heavy miner helmets scattered around the entrance of an old ventilation shaft. The tracks inside the shaft led deep into abandoned coal workings that ran directly beneath the residential section of the town. Mining archives showed these particular tunnels had been closed down by the federal government back in 1965. Investigators never confirmed whether an illegal salvage operation had been active inside the dangerous and unmapped subterranean passages. The investigators recovered a waterlogged leather notebook from a metal locker inside the foreman office at the depot. Archived notes from a retired rail supervisor indicated that a massive underground pocket of methane gas had been expanding for months. The final handwritten entry described a sudden shift in the mountain bedrock that threatened to collapse the entire valley floor. The supervisor wrote that the air quality had dropped below safe levels and made an immediate evacuation absolutely necessary. They apparently fled into the deep mountain tunnels to escape the toxic fumes because the highway was blocked by a rock slide. Records conflict regarding whether the residents ever emerged from the complex network of interconnected cavern systems on the other side. The state authorities ultimately classified the valley as a permanent hazard zone and restricted all public entry with high fences. Gideon stood on the ridge months later and watched heavy machinery dump tons of gravel into the main valley entrance. The empty houses of Cinder Creek remained standing as rotting skeletons of a town that was swallowed by the mountain. Investigators closed the official file, but the true location of the residents remains a dark mystery among the regional population. The silent and overgrown valley is the only remaining reminder of the night an entire Appalachian community vanished into thin air. In this new story. Terrifying true encounters from the deep Appalachian Mountains. In 2013, 24-year-old park ranger Elias Thorne was stationed in a remote sector of the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia. His primary objective involved surveying trail erosion following a series of heavy storms that had compromised the structural integrity of the local ridgelines. Thorne was an experienced outdoorsman who possessed a deep understanding of the regional topography and the inherent risks associated with isolated mountain navigation. Reportedly, he had completed hundreds of similar solo patrols without incident during his 3-year tenure with the Forestry Department. However, county files from 2013 indicate that his final scheduled check-in never reached the regional dispatch center that evening. The initial search efforts commenced within 6 hours of the missed radio contact as local authorities followed the documented route left in the official logs. State records indicate that search parties found Thorne's abandoned utility vehicle parked at a designated trailhead with his personal gear still inside the cabin. Some investigators noted that the driver's side door remained wide open despite the approaching cold front and the significant drop in ambient temperature. Archived notes from the primary search coordinator describe a scene where there were no signs of a struggle or any forced entry. Dispatch logs from that night confirm that a heavy fog rolled through the valley, which significantly hindered the visibility for the ground teams. By the morning of the second day, a group of local volunteers claimed they discovered a series of unusual depressions in the soft mud. Investigators never confirmed if these markings were of human origin or simply the result of natural erosion occurring near the creek bed. State records show that the tracks led toward a steep limestone cavern system that was not marked on any of the modern geological maps. According to several archived notes from the period, the cave entrance appeared to have been recently disturbed by something of significant physical mass. The team found a single torn piece of a standard forestry uniform snagged on a sharp rock fragment deep within the dark passage. A secondary forensic team arrived on site to examine the evidence, but they found that the subterranean environment was too unstable for a full descent. Records conflict regarding the exact depth of the shaft, and whether the sounds reported by the volunteers were echoes or something more tangible. Some locals claimed they heard a rhythmic metallic scraping emanating from the limestone depths during the quiet hours of the early morning search. County files from 2013 reflect that no animal known to the region would produce a sound matching the descriptions provided by those witnesses. The official investigation eventually stalled due to the lack of physical remains and the increasingly hazardous conditions inside the crumbling cavern system. As the weeks passed into 2014, search teams expanded their radius to include the higher elevation ridges located several miles from the vehicle. Records from the county sheriff department indicate that a second-person 29-year-old surveyor named Sarah Miller also went missing nearby. Miller was reportedly working on a private land assessment project when her equipment was found neatly stacked on a granite boulder. State records show that her GPS unit had been placed on top of the stack and was still powered on when found. Investigators never confirmed why she would abandon her high-value tools in the middle of a shift during broad daylight. Archive notes from the Miller case file describe a series of inconsistent witness accounts regarding her movements on the day she vanished. Some locals claimed they saw a figure matching her description walking toward the high peaks without any of her necessary safety gear. Dispatch logs from that afternoon do not record any distress signals or calls for assistance from her assigned mobile radio unit. State records indicate that the search for Miller was eventually merged with the ongoing investigation into the disappearance of Elias Thorne. Authorities noted that both individuals were last seen within a 5-mile radius of the same unmapped limestone cavern system. During the summer of 2014, a team of specialized cave divers attempted to explore the flooded lower chambers of the mountain range. County files from 2014 suggest that the divers discovered a series of narrow tunnels that showed evidence of human occupation. Archive notes describe the presence of several rusted tools and fragments of clothing that appeared to date back several decades. Investigators never confirmed if these items belonged to recent missing persons or to workers from an abandoned mining operation. Records conflict about whether the tunnel system connects to the surface at any point other than the main limestone entrance. One diver reportedly claimed that he saw a series of deliberate markings etched into the stone walls deep beneath the waterline. These markings appeared to be a set of dates and initials, but the silt levels made it impossible to capture clear images. State records show that the diving operation was terminated early after 2 members of the team experienced unexplained equipment malfunctions. Dispatch logs indicate that both divers reported a sudden and total loss of their primary lighting systems simultaneously while in separate chambers. No technical reason for the double failure was ever identified by the equipment manufacturers during the subsequent forensic review. 14 months later, a pair of hikers in a neighboring county located a rusted handheld radio resting on a high rocky ledge. State records verify that the serial number on the device matched the unit issued to Thorne before his disappearance. The ledge was located over 12 miles away from the original search area and required a level of climbing skill Thorne did not possess. Investigators found that the battery had been removed and the internal components were completely corroded by long-term exposure. There was no explanation for how the device reached such a remote and inaccessible location without the use of specialized gear is less than hash. Zero hash is greater than. Historical data from the county archives mentions a similar series of unexplained disappearances that occurred in the same region in 1976. State records from that era describe a group of 4 experienced backpackers who vanished while navigating the Monongahela forest ridgelines. According to archive notes, the only evidence found was a single tent that had been sliced open from the inside. Investigators never confirmed if the cuts were made by a tool or by the jagged rocks surrounding the campsite. Some locals claimed that the hikers had wandered into an area known for magnetic anomalies that interfere with compass readings. Dispatch logs from 1976 indicate that search teams were forced to retreat due to a sudden and uncharacteristic seismic event. State records show that the ground tremors caused significant shifts in the local cave systems, which altered the landscape permanently. Archived notes from the time suggest that several previously known entrances were swallowed by the shifting limestone plates during the event. Investigators never confirmed if the missing backpackers were trapped in the lower chambers when the geological shift occurred. The files were eventually closed due to a lack of physical evidence or credible leads regarding their final coordinates. In 2015, a local rancher reported finding an old leather satchel partially buried in a dry creek bed near the mountain base. State records indicate that the satchel contained a set of handwritten journals belonging to an unknown individual from 2012. Archived notes from the forensic examination describe the entries as a series of meticulous observations regarding the movement of local wildlife. One specific entry reportedly mentions a large bipedal figure that the author observed watching the camp from the tree line. Investigators never confirmed the identity of the journal author or why the satchel was abandoned in such a precarious spot. The journals also contained a hand-drawn map of the limestone cavern system that featured several exits not found on modern maps. State records show that one of these exits was located near the ledge where Thorne's radio was discovered later. Some investigators questioned if a hidden network of tunnels allowed for rapid movement across the difficult mountain terrain without being detected. Dispatch logs from 2015 indicate that a brief follow-up search was conducted based on the coordinates in the journal. However, the teams found that the specific area mentioned had been covered by a massive rockfall following the 2013 storms. County files from 2016 detail a report of strange light patterns observed by commercial pilots flying over the Monongahela region. State records indicate that the lights appeared as a series of blue pulses originating from the deep mountain valleys. Investigators never confirmed the source of the illumination, although some suggested it was atmospheric phenomena common to high altitudes. Archive notes from the federal aviation logs show that the pulses did not correspond to any known ground-based signals. These reports coincided with another brief spike in local missing person cases that occurred during the same calendar month. The case of Elias Thorne and Sarah Miller remains open in the state records, although no new leads have surfaced recently. Dispatch logs from the original search are still categorized as incomplete because of the numerous reports that were never officially verified. Some locals claimed that the mountain terrain itself changes during heavy fog, making it nearly impossible for even experienced rangers to navigate. Archived notes from the lead investigator suggest that Thorne might have simply succumbed to the elements after becoming disoriented. However, the lack of a body and the strange placement of his equipment continue to fuel a sense of uncertainty in this new story. True creepy and scary horror stories from the Appalachian Mountains. In the autumn of 2021, a 24-year-old hiker named Elias Thorne, who worked as a land surveyor, entered the dense timber of the Monongahela National Forest for a weekend trek. He intended to document seasonal soil erosion patterns along the high ridges near the West Virginia border while testing new GPS equipment in deep terrain. Local dispatch logs from that evening indicate that the weather turned abruptly and a thick fog settled over the limestone valleys without any prior warning. Elias was a seasoned outdoorsman who understood the risks of the Appalachian landscape, but he reportedly failed to check in with his emergency contact. Investigators never confirmed if he strayed from the marked path or if the shifting weather conditions simply obscured the familiar landmarks of the trail. According to archive notes from the regional search team, Elias began to experience a series of equipment failures as he reached the higher elevations. The GPS unit displayed conflicting coordinates that suggested he was moving south, while his compass indicated a steady northern heading toward the primary base camp. He eventually decided to set up a temporary shelter near a rocky outcropping because the visibility had dropped to less than 10 feet. State records indicate that several other hikers in the vicinity reported hearing repetitive metallic sounds echoing through the trees during the late hours of the night. Some locals claimed that the sounds were merely the result of wind moving through abandoned mining shafts, but the county file from 2009 suggests otherwise. Elias woke up during the early morning hours to find that his heavy hiking boots had been moved precisely 3 feet away from his tent. There were no footprints in the soft mud surrounding his campsite, and the internal zipper of his tent was still locked from the previous night. He gathered his belongings in total silence while observing that the surrounding forest had become unnaturally quiet, as if the local wildlife had fled. Records conflict regarding the exact path he took to exit the forest, but Elias later stated that he felt a constant presence just behind him. The investigation concluded without finding any evidence of another person in the area, and the case remains a point of ambiguity for the local authorities. The state records from 2022 mention a second individual named Sarah Miller, who was a 32-year-old biologist studying local bat populations. Sarah was stationed in a remote cabin near the Clench Mountain Range, where she spent several weeks collecting data on nocturnal migratory patterns. Her logs mention that she discovered several strange markings carved into the trees surrounding her research site during the first week of her stay. She reportedly captured several audio recordings of a voice that seemed to mimic her own vocal patterns from the previous evening. Investigators never confirmed the source of the audio, but the archive notes suggest that Sarah became increasingly paranoid about her immediate surroundings. County files from 2015 describe an incident involving a park ranger named Marcus Reed, who was 45 years old at the time. Marcus was tasked with patrolling the northern boundaries of the Great Smoky Mountains, where several campers had reported seeing flickering lights in the distance. He arrived at a clearing near a decommissioned fire tower and discovered a collection of personal items neatly arranged in a circular pattern. The items included a digital watch and a pair of spectacles that appeared to belong to a missing person from 2012. Dispatch logs indicate that Marcus requested immediate backup after hearing a heavy breathing sound coming from the darkness just beyond his flashlight beam. Some locals claimed that the fire tower was the site of a forgotten settlement, but official state records show no evidence of any historical structures. Marcus reported that he saw a tall figure standing perfectly still near the base of the tower, but the figure vanished when he approached. The county file from 2009 mentions a similar encounter involving a group of hunters who were tracking deer in the same region. These men reportedly abandoned their equipment and fled the area after witnessing a series of blue flashes emanating from the forest floor. Investigators never confirmed the cause of the flashes, and the terrain was later declared off-limits for several months following the incident. A third individual, named James Bennett, was a 50-year-old retired police officer who enjoyed solo camping trips in the Blue Ridge Mountains. In the spring of 2016, he planned a 5-day excursion through a section of the forest known for its treacherous slopes. James was equipped with a high-frequency radio and a detailed map of the region that he had used for over 20 years. Archive notes indicate that he sent a brief transmission on the second night, stating that he had found an unmarked cave entrance. The transmission ended abruptly with a sharp static noise that the dispatch center was unable to filter or identify using standard equipment. Search teams arrived at the coordinates of the cave entrance only to find that the opening had been blocked by a massive rockfall. They discovered James's radio sitting on top of a flat stone, but there was no sign of a struggle or any physical tracks. Records conflict about whether the rockfall was a natural occurrence or if it had been triggered by an external force during the night. Some locals claimed to hear a muffled tapping sound coming from behind the rocks, but the sound was never captured on official recording devices. The state records from 2017 officially closed the case as a tragic accident involving an unforeseen geological event in a remote area. Investigators later discovered a series of photographs on James's camera that depicted a dark corridor lined with what appeared to be rusted metal doors. The photographs were blurry, and the light source was insufficient to provide a clear view of what lay beyond the threshold of the cave. Dispatch logs from that period show that several unauthorized individuals attempted to access the site before it was permanently sealed by the county. The county file from 2009 mentions a local legend about a hidden facility, but no evidence of such a place exists. James remains missing, and the true nature of the unmarked cave entrance continues to be a subject of intense local debate. In the winter of 2018, a 29-year-old geographer named Thomas Vance traveled to the rural outskirts of Kentucky. Thomas was employed by a private environmental firm to map the underground water tables and limestone aquifers hidden beneath the rugged hills. He reportedly established a base camp in a valley that local residents often avoided due to the frequent presence of heavy ground mist. State records from that month indicate that Thomas made several calls to his supervisor regarding anomalous readings on his seismic detection tools. The readings suggested that a large hollow space existed directly beneath his tent, but no known maps indicated any subterranean tunnels. According to dispatch logs, Thomas reported that the ground beneath his feet felt like it was vibrating rhythmically every night at 3 a.m. He decided to document the phenomenon using a high-sensitivity microphone and a series of motion sensors placed around the valley floor. Archived notes show that Thomas recorded a sound that resembled a low-frequency hum that caused structural damage to his electronic gear. Investigators never confirmed the source of the vibration, but the county file from 2009 mentions similar reports from local farmers. Thomas was found 3 days later wandering along a remote logging road in a state of deep confusion and physical exhaustion. He reportedly claimed that he had seen a series of vertical shafts hidden beneath the thick brush that were lined with smooth glass. The state records indicate that Thomas had lost all memory of how he had escaped the valley or where his equipment went. Search crews returned to the campsite, but they discovered that the entire area had been swept clean of any human presence. Even the flattened grass where his tent had stood was now standing upright as if no weight had ever been applied. Records conflict on whether Thomas suffered from a medical episode or if he had encountered an undocumented geographic feature in the hills. In this news story, 3 disturbing small-town horror stories. Part 1. The town where nobody locked their doors. Most people in the American heartland believe that absolute trust is a sign of a healthy and safe community. This account from a remote mountain village suggests that leaving your front door unlatched might be an invitation for disaster. In the isolated village of Blackwood Hollow, the local culture was built on the fact that no one locked doors. Harlan Reed was a 41-year-old postal carrier who walked the quiet streets of the hollow every afternoon. He had lived in the town since 1982, and he knew the specific habits of every single neighbor. The locals believed that their safety was guaranteed by the surrounding mountains and the long history of their shared ancestors. Harlan enjoyed the predictability of his route because it allowed him to finish his work before the early winter darkness. He often dropped off packages directly inside the mudrooms of the elderly residents who could not easily reach their porches. This level of trust was the foundation of the town, and no one ever questioned the safety of the practice. The atmosphere began to change during the first week of November in the year 2021 without any warning. Harlan was delivering a heavy box to a Victorian-style home owned by a woman named Mrs. Gable, who lived. He pushed the front door open as he had done for 15 years, but he felt a sudden and sharp. The house was silent, and the air inside felt significantly colder than the crisp autumn breeze blowing through the yard. He called out for Mrs. Gable, but his voice seemed to be absorbed by the heavy curtains and thick rugs. He noticed that the furniture in the living room had been moved into a tight circle facing the front door. This was strange because the elderly woman was known for her obsession with keeping her home in a perfect state. Harlan left the package on the floor and stepped back outside because he could not shake the feeling of... He mentioned the odd encounter to the local sheriff named Silas Thorne while they were eating lunch at the diner. Silas suggested that the woman was simply redecorating for the upcoming holiday season in the hollow, but Harlan remained. By the middle of the following week, Harlan noticed similar patterns in several other homes along his daily delivery route. Doors were standing wide open even when the temperature dropped below freezing and the residents were nowhere to be seen. He stopped at the home of a young mechanic named Elias Vance, who was usually working in his garage. The garage was empty and the tools were scattered across the concrete floor as if they had been dropped suddenly. Harlan walked to the back door and found it unlatched and swinging slowly in the damp and heavy wind. He entered the kitchen and saw 3 plates of steaming hot food sitting on the small wooden table in silence. The family was gone, but the television was still playing a local news broadcast from a city 50 miles away. He felt a sense of vertigo as he realized the residents had not simply walked away from their homes. Harlan decided to conduct his own investigation because the authorities seemed disinterested in the strange behavior of the quiet town. He returned to the post office and began to look through the historical archives of Blackwood Hollow from many decades. He found a series of newspaper clippings that described a similar event that occurred in the winter of 1950. Several families had disappeared from their homes overnight, leaving behind open doors and half-eaten meals on their dining tables. The reports mentioned that the only witness was a young boy who spoke about a tall figure wearing a hat. This figure reportedly walked through the streets and knocked on every door that was not properly secured with a bolt. Harlan realized that the current residents were following a tradition that they did not fully understand or even remember. They left their doors open because they believed it kept them safe from the thing that wanted to enter. He spent the next 3 nights watching the main street from the window of his small apartment above the pharmacy. The town was deathly quiet, and the only sound was the howling of the wind through the dark mountain passes. On the 3rd night, he saw a dark shape moving slowly between the houses on the far side of town. The figure was remarkably tall and wore a tattered coat that seemed to blend into the shadows of the trees. Harlan watched in horror as the figure approached the front door of the local grocery store and pushed it open. The figure emerged a few minutes later and moved toward the next house with a purposeful and steady gait. The next morning, he went to the grocery store to see if the owner, named Arthur, was still there. Arthur was sitting in the middle of the aisle, staring at the ceiling with a look of pure and absolute. He did not respond when Harlan called his name or when he shook him gently by the heavy coat. Harlan realized that the town was being harvested by something that used the open doors as an invitation to enter. The residents were not being taken by force, but were surrendering to a force they could not possibly hope. He returned to his apartment and finally did the one thing that no one in the town had ever. He closed his front door and turned the heavy brass deadbolt until he heard a loud and satisfying click. The scratching started at exactly midnight and continued for several hours as the entity circled the small and dark apartment. Harlan could hear the heavy breathing of the thing on the other side of the thin wooden door in silence. It whispered his name in a voice that sounded like the rustling of dry leaves in a very deep. The deadbolt held firm, and the scratching eventually stopped as the sun began to rise over the cold mountain. He finally gathered the courage to open the door and walk out into the streets of the hollow once more. The town was completely empty, and there was no sign of the residents or the tall figure in the. The open doors were still swinging in the wind, but the houses were now hollow shells of their former selves. The police files confirm that 100 people disappeared without a single trace of a struggle or a crime. Harlan Reed still lives in a city where every door is locked, and he never forgets the open doors. The mystery remains as deep as the woods and as old as the fear of the dark and the. This story serves as a reminder that some traditions are actually chains that bind us to a very dark. The silence of Blackwood Hollow is the only legacy left behind for those who chose to leave doors open. Part 2. Everyone heard screams. Nobody called the police. Most violent crimes happen in the shadows of the night when no one is around to witness the actual struggle. This story is different because it happened in the middle of a crowded neighborhood where every single person was listening. The bystander effect is a documented phenomenon where people fail to help when others are present in a large group. In the autumn of 2021, a small community in Ohio learned how dangerous this silence can truly be. Vance Whitaker was a 45-year-old retired machinery operator who lived in a brick apartment complex in Ohio. He liked the quiet nature of the suburbs because it allowed him to focus on his gardening and local woodcraft. On the night of October 12th, 2021, he was sitting in his living room watching a classic film. The complex was designed with a central courtyard where residents often gathered to talk during the warm summer months now. At approximately 10 o'clock that night, a piercing scream echoed through the courtyard and vibrated against the thin glass windows. Vance paused his movie and looked toward the window, but he did not see any movement in the dark shadows. He noticed that the moonlight was casting long and jagged shapes across the brick walls of the apartment buildings tonight. He assumed it was just a group of teenagers playing a prank or perhaps a loud television in another unit. He waited for several minutes for a second sound, but the courtyard remained deathly silent under the dim yellow lights. The air was thick with the scent of damp leaves and the lingering smell of charcoal from a nearby grill. He decided to go back to his movie and ignored the nagging feeling that something was wrong in the complex. Another scream rang out 10 minutes later, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps running across the wet pavement below. Vance stood up and walked to his balcony, but he could only see the silhouettes of his neighbors looking out. No one was shouting for help, and no one was running outside to investigate the source of the terrifying noise. He saw the lights in the apartment across the way flicker on and then off as if someone was watching. Vance felt a sense of relief because he assumed his neighbors were already calling the police to report the disturbance. He sat back down on his worn leather sofa and tried to focus on the dialogue of the old film. The screaming stopped after 30 minutes and was replaced by the low hum of the wind through the courtyard trees. He went to bed shortly after midnight, convinced that the situation had been resolved by the local authorities already today. The next morning, he woke up to the sound of sirens and saw several police cruisers parked in the lot. Yellow crime scene tape was draped across the entrance to the courtyard where he had heard the screams last night. He walked outside and saw a group of his neighbors standing together with looks of deep confusion and mounting guilt. A detective named Silas Thorne began to knock on every door to ask if anyone had heard anything unusual recently. Vance told the detective about the screams and mentioned that he thought someone else had already called the emergency line. The detective looked at his notepad and informed Vance that not a single person in the complex had called them. There were 48 occupied units in the building, and every single resident admitted to hearing the screams that night. They all gave the same excuse that they assumed someone else would take the responsibility for calling the police now. The victim was a 30-year-old woman named Elena Vance, who worked as a night shift nurse nearby today. She had been attacked while walking from her car to the front door of her building in the open air. The investigation revealed that the attacker had stayed in the courtyard for over an hour because he knew no one. He had moved with a calculated slowness because he realized the neighbors were watching but doing nothing to stop him. The forensic team found several discarded cigarette butts near the bushes where the attacker had waited for his next move. The most disturbing part of the case was the realization that the screams were not actually coming from Elena Vance. The detective found a small digital recorder hidden in the bushes that was programmed to play a loop of screams. The attacker had used the recording to desensitize the neighbors and see if anyone would actually step outside to help. Elena had been taken in total silence while the neighbors were distracted by the loud and artificial noise in courtyard. The police found her car door wide open and her keys still hanging from the lock in the driver's side. The twist in the investigation came when they reviewed the security footage from a camera hidden in the lobby area. The man who planted the recorder was not a stranger, but a resident who lived on the third floor now. His name was Julian Reed, and he was a quiet 38-year-old accountant who never caused any trouble. He had spent weeks studying the habits of his neighbors to ensure that his psychological experiment would work perfectly today. Julian did not want to kill anyone, but he wanted to prove that the community was built on false trust. He had taken Elena to a nearby warehouse and left her there safely to show how easy it was. The police found Elena unharmed, but the psychological damage to the residents of the complex was permanent and very deep. Every person who lived in that building eventually moved away because they could no longer look at their neighbors' faces. Vance Whitaker left Ohio a month later and moved to a small cabin where he did not have any neighbors. He realized that the silence of the woods was much safer than the silence of a crowd of indifferent people. The case remains a chilling reminder that we cannot always rely on others to do the right thing in moments. If you hear a scream in the night, you should be the one who makes the call to the police. The ending of this story sounds fake, but the police records confirm the strange details of the social experiment today. Some people want to watch the world burn, and others just want to watch their neighbors do absolutely nothing now. Local psychologists often cite the Blackwood Hollow incident as the perfect example of how urban isolation affects our basic instincts. It remains a mandatory case study for university students who are learning about the complex nature of human social behavior. The recorded screams are still kept in a secure evidence locker at the police station as a grim historical artifact. People who move into the complex today are never told about the night that everyone listened to the darkness alone. Vance Whitaker sometimes looks at the old news clippings and wonders if he would do anything differently if it happened. The silence of the neighborhood was a choice that 48 people made together without ever saying a single word. The world is full of sounds, but the most important ones are often the ones that we choose to ignore. Part 3. The family everyone avoided. Most people who live in the rural corners of northern Maine understand that privacy is a very respected local tradition. There was one specific household on the edge of the woods that made even the most hardened loggers feel uneasy. Beckett Lowry was a 45-year-old carpenter who supposedly moved into the old Miller estate in the winter. He was joined by his wife Alara and their young daughter Maisie, who was rarely seen playing in the yard. The neighbors noticed immediately that the family never traveled into town to buy groceries or supplies like a normal family. They would only see the three of them standing at the edge of the dark forest during the late evening. The Lowry family stood perfectly still for hours while staring into the dense trees as if they were waiting there. No one in the small community ever dared to knock on their door or offer a warm welcome to the quote. The local mail carrier, named Arthur, was the only person who had any regular contact with the strange Miller property. He noticed that the grass in the front yard never seemed to grow despite the heavy rain of the spring. The windows of the house were always covered with thick black fabric that prevented anyone from seeing the interior rooms. In the summer of 1997, Arthur noticed that the mailbox was overflowing with letters and local circular advertisements. He walked up the porch steps and felt a sudden drop in temperature that made his skin crawl with dread. He looked through a small gap in the window fabric and saw the three family members sitting at the table. They were not eating or talking, but were simply staring at the front door with wide and unblinking pale eyes. Arthur dropped the mail and ran back to his truck because the silence from the house felt like He reported the strange incident to the local sheriff named Silas Thorne, who had been patrolling the area for years. Silas was a practical man who did not believe in local legends or the whispered fears of the nervous townspeople. He agreed to perform a welfare check on the Lowry family to ensure that no one was sick or hurt. The sheriff drove to the estate the following morning and found the front door was standing wide open and unlatched. He stepped inside the foyer and was immediately struck by the thick layer of dust covering every single piece of. It looked as if no one had lived in the house for at least 30 years despite the recent sightings. He walked into the kitchen and found the three family members sitting exactly where Arthur had described them the day. The sheriff approached Beckett Lowry and touched his shoulder, but the man did not move or respond to the contact. Silas realized with a shock that the bodies were not alive, but were perfectly preserved and very realistic wax figures. He searched the rest of the house and found a collection of old newspaper clippings hidden under the floorboards. The articles described a family named Lowry who had disappeared from a different state in the year 1967. The photographs in the newspapers matched the faces of the wax figures sitting in the kitchen with terrifying and exact. Silas found a journal in the basement that described a man who wanted to recreate his lost family forever today. The writer had spent decades building the figures and moving them around the yard to simulate a normal and living crumb. The neighbors had not seen a real family, but had been watching a grieving man move statues in the dark. The investigation revealed that the real Beckett Lowry had died of natural causes in the basement several months prior today. His body was found resting near a workbench filled with sculpting tools and various jars of heavy industrial grade. The mystery of why the neighbors saw the figures standing on their own remains a topic of local debate now. Some people believe the grief was so strong that it left a permanent stain on the old Miller estate grounds. The house was eventually torn down, but people still avoid the empty lot where the family used to stand. The forest is quiet now, and no one stands at the edge of the trees during the late evening hours. It is a reminder that the things we avoid are often much sadder than the monsters we usually imagine. The police files confirm that the Lowry family was never actually in the state of Maine during that time.